Today is Transfiguration Sunday, and what the Transfiguration shows us is that who God is and who we will become. The Transfiguration shows us who God is and who we will become. And that's what the disciples, Peter, James, and John, were getting a glimpse of when they went up on that mountain and saw the face of Jesus changed before them. They were seeing a glimpse of God's bright face, who God is and God's completeness. And they saw a glimpse of where we are headed as the people of God, this transfigured people. And you know, it's not always easy, as I reflect on this, to know where God is at work and what's going on in the world and kind of what God is doing behind the scenes. But I believe in all of this, in all of our life, that God is there and that God is present and that there is a brightness, that God's face is behind a lot of the things that we see in our lives in the world, and that God, by His providence, is at work. And we don't always see it, and I think a little bit of how, a block of stone, for most of us it will just seem like a huge slab of marble or whatever, but to a sculptor, to the sculptor's eyes, there is a vision. They can see the curves and the fracture lines and the grain of the stone, and they'll know where they are going to carve a statue out of that. And in fact, the great Renaissance sculptor Michelangelo once said, and this is one of his stones, but he once said that every stone has a statue inside of it, and it is the sculptor's job to find that statue. And I think about that a little bit as we talk about the Transfiguration today, this Sunday between Epiphany and between Lent that's pointing us towards Christ's journey of the cross, where He grabs the disciples and takes them with Him and goes up and shows them this transfigured vision of reality, because God's showing us what He sees. God's showing us how He looks at the world, and it is different. It is not just the stone, it's the statue within the stone. God is allowing those disciples to capture a vision of how He sees things. And just a short time ago in this passage in Matthew, in chapter 16, Jesus had predicted his death, and He had said He's going to be handed over to the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and He'd said that He's going to be killed, and on the third day that He is going to be raised to life. And then He said in verse 28, "I tell you the truth. Some are standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom." And then here He is. Matthew says it's 6 days later, and He is revealing this glimpse of Himself and of His kingdom to Peter, James, and John. And He takes them up on this mountain. In verse 2, we read that He is transfigured before them, that His face shone like the sun and His clothes became as white as the light. And so all is light, and this bright cloud surrounds them. I mean, He's just glowing, and there is no white paint chip for this color, right? It is brighter than anything that we can bleach our clothes, and there He is transfigured. And the Scripture uses a word here that is the same word for metamorphosize. And so you think about things that metamorphosize in nature, like a tadpole, right? That goes through a metamorphosis and becomes a frog, or the caterpillar that goes through metamorphosis and becomes a butterfly. It's that same word, to change shape, to change the face. And God is revealing here in Jesus the fullness of who Jesus is. It's not that Jesus is taking off a mask and that He's revealing His divine self as if He weren't really human, but He's showing the fullness of who He is to the disciples, that He is God in the flesh. In Colossians, Paul talks about this, and he says that in Jesus the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, that He is the firstborn of all creation, that He is the one that in Him all things hold together. And so that is what the disciples are seeing, this vision of Jesus in His fullness. Not that He's taking off a mask, but the vision of who He is in His entirety. the face of God, and the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Very soon after he is transfigured, we see Moses and Elijah standing beside him. Moses as a representative of the law, Elijah as a representative of the prophets. And these two citizens of the kingdom who demonstrate the kind of relationship that God is calling all of his people to have, because it's a conversational relationship with Jesus, and they're talking to him, right, about what's going on. It's this conversational relationship with Jesus, and there they are standing in the brightness. And Peter, who seems like one of these guys that's always got to have a plan. Peter wants to be on top of these things. Even though he's hearing the words from the clouds, "This is my son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased," Peter wants to kind of capture this moment. And God adds, it's almost the same words that God said at Jesus' baptism, right? "This is my son, and the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." But God adds here, listen to him. And Peter, he kind of gets ahead of himself, and he's like, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." Right? He senses he's in a sacred place, like Moses when he shows up and sees that burning bush in the book of Exodus. It is good for us to be here. Let me build some shelters. And who knows what Peter had in mind? I mean, it could have been a couple of things. There was the festival of booths from the book of Leviticus, this ancient Hebrew festival where the people went out and would make little structures where they would remember the wilderness wanderings that they had experienced so long ago. And maybe he was thinking something like that. Maybe he just was trying to find a way to kind of keep this event going, to capture the moment, to sort of box God in a little bit. And, I don't think he had any bad idea. I just didn't know what he was talking about. He was really overwhelmed by this vision of Jesus transfigured before him. And maybe he had this idea to keep the moment fresh by kind of making some shelters for them. But you can't put God inside of these walls, even holy habitations. I mean, it won't last. And he says, "Lord, it's good for us to be here," but he can't capture God in that place. And it is good for us to be in the presence of Jesus and to sense that God's glory is breaking out and breaking in a new way, and to see the bright face of God like these disciples were. But what is that goodness, right, that they see? What is it about the transfiguration that so captured Peter's attention? And, what's it got to do with us? And I think about this, and I think that first and foremost, when we talk about the transfiguration, when we see this vision with Peter and James and John, it's a vision of Jesus' identity. He's revealing more about who he is and what he came to do. And so, in chapter 16, he had talked to the disciples and he said, "Who do you say that I am?" Right? And they had some different ideas. It was only Peter that was able to really get it. He said, "You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God." And so they're capturing this vision of who Jesus is. And it wasn't that he was hiding his identity before, but here you see the fullness of it. He's both God and man. It's this theological moment. It's like the Nicene Creed puts it, that he's God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. It's Jesus' basic identity revealed up there on the mountaintop. But brothers and sisters, it is not a theological lesson, or it's not just a theological lesson, because what Jesus is showing them is what is really real. And here's what I mean by that. That he's saying there is more than just this reality at work, that there is more than meets the eye, that the universe is bigger than you might have thought, than we might think. And I mean, we know this, right? Because we've all experienced these moments when there's more going on than we think. And it, just in a very basic sense, right? Our human eyes, we see visual light, but there's a whole lot that we don't see. So we can't see heat. We can't see in the infrared spectrum. And we can't see ultraviolet light like some insects can. And so there's all sorts of aspects of the world that we are not picking up on with our eyes. Or even think about time. We live in the moment and we can kind of see the present moment. We cannot see the past. and we cannot see the future. We are limited in how much we can see. And so Jesus is showing them there's more than meets the eye. There's more than going on. And at the same time, Jesus is telling them, I'm going to be killed and handed over to the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's going to be handed over to the powers that be. And if I were the disciples, I'd be like, well, then why should we be following you? Right? Because if this is how it's going to end, what's the difference between you and so many others who have come along and have claimed to be the Messiah who are going to liberate Israel? But how many of them have ended up ground in the gears of empire? What makes you any different, Jesus? But see, here's this moment when he reveals what it is that makes him different, that there's something special, something worth paying attention to. Listen to him as God speaks out of the cloud. And we're catching this vision of God, of who God really is. And God is not this ancient Roman deity. He's not Zeus or something like that sits on high and throws thunderbolts out of the sky. God is a God who is with his people, who is with them in the places of brokenness, who goes to the cross for them, who bleeds for them, who suffers with them, who lifts up his people and shows them the way. And there he is on the mountaintop. And we know that if God is with his people on the mountaintop, then he's also going to be with his people in the valleys. And so we capture this glimpse of who God really is. One author said that the cross, and this is pointing us to the cross irradiates the splendid form of God's self-giving love. This is my Son, the beloved. In him I am well pleased. Listen to him. It's who God really is. This God who loves us. This God who forgives us. This God who calls us up onto the mountaintops and goes with us down into the valleys and hits the cross for our sake. The bright face of God illumined in the face of Jesus of Nazareth. And later on, Peter will reflect on his experience. It's interesting in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 and following, Peter talks a little bit about what he experienced up on that mountaintop. And he says, we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. We ourselves heard that voice that came from heaven when we were on the sacred mountain. And he goes on, it was a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. And that's what it's all about. This transfiguration, that's what it means to us, that there is more going on than meets the eye, that God is at work in ways that we might not discern at first, that there is a light shining in the darkness. And so we are called to be a people of hope, to take heart, to have faith, to listen to Jesus because he knows what he's talking about and he's going to lead us on the right way. There's more going on than we thought. And I had an experience like this a couple of years ago. We were traveling into the country, came through Miami airport, and it was a while ago. We were expecting baby Mateo, and we put our passports on the desk. And, they take a look at everything there as you're coming into the country. And we put our passports on the desk, and the guy asked us some questions that didn't kind of click for us. We didn't know what he was talking about. And he must have hit a little button under the desk because suddenly the armed guards came and escorted us to the room. And you don't want to go to the room in an international airport. It's a place where they're holding you, and it was comfortable enough, but it's a place where they're holding you and other people until they decide whether your papers all line up or whether you're trying to enter the country illegally. And so it's the kind of place where there are guards at the door. And if you need to go to the bathroom, the guards go with you to the bathroom, and the toilet is made out of stainless steel and has no moving parts and anything that you could break off. And so we're sitting there in this place with some other immigrants who are trying to figure out their situation. And I go up and I talk to one of the guys behind the desk, and I'm like, listen, after I prayed about this and talked to Lisi about it, I'm like, listen, there's nothing wrong with my wife's papers. I think the guy must have looked at the wrong page. He's like, well, sorry, the system's down. And I said, look, there's nothing wrong with her papers, and if we don't get going, we're going to miss our flight. And he said, sorry. And I just stood there, and he looks at me, and he goes, oh, fine. Stamps the passport, stamp, 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 go. And we had this moment where it didn't look like God was involved in any way, like we were going to be in deep trouble. And here it was, where God was at work and got us out of this tough situation that we could not have gotten ourselves out of. And we have these moments every once in a while in reality, right, where God is at work in ways that we cannot see. And in fact, I think this is one of those grand messages of the Bible. And I look back at Genesis and Joseph, right? Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, when Joseph had been sold into slavery because of the jealousy of his brothers. And he rises through the ranks of the Egyptian hierarchy and is later able to save his family. And when he reveals himself, he says to them, "You intended this for evil, but God meant this for good, for the saving of a people." God was at work. Or I think about Esther, who rose to become queen of Persia from very lowly rank. And in chapter 4, her uncle says to her, "Who knows, Esther, perhaps you have risen to royal power for such a time as this, to be able to save your people." I think about Job, who, even though he went through some difficult circumstances that are hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around, at the end has a vision of God. And he says, "I had heard about you with the hearing of the ears, but now I have seen you with the seeing of the eyes, and I am satisfied." He has this encounter with God and is able to come away and know that God was at work in ways that he hadn't realized at first. And then in Romans chapter 8, where Paul says, "We know all things work for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purposes." So God is at work with this power that is more than all we can ever ask or imagine. And we don't always believe it because we don't always see what's going on, and we so easily can get boxed in, and we can so easily get hopeless. And if I were one of the disciples, I would have felt pretty hopeless, right? Because Jesus said, "I'm going to the cross." He said, "They're going to arrest me." He said, "They're going to kill me, and they're going to take me away." And so I would be like, well, what's the point? Let's just stop right now. But God is at work in ways that are deeper than they could have imagined him. And this happens to us all the time where we get boxed in, a little bit like how Peter was trying to box in the divine presence of God, and our horizons shrink down really small, and we can think that there is no way out, and we can think that there is no help for us and nowhere for us to go, and we get escorted to the room, and God, can you do anything for us? But God's bright face shining on that mountaintop means that there is more going on than meets the eye. And this is why we listen to Jesus through thick and thin, no matter what happens, because we think that he knows what he's talking about, and that if he shines on the mountaintop, he's going to be with us in the valleys. And listen, I suspect and I know that there are some of us here this morning and folks in our church that are feeling boxed in, that are feeling stuck, that are feeling like there aren't any good choices, that this is it. But do not lose hope. Do not give up, because Jesus is among us, and God's glorious love is working among us and pointing us beyond our present circumstances, and there is a way out. You are not locked in. And it doesn't mean that everything is always going to work out the way that we would have planned it. It does mean that sometimes things are going to not look so good for us for a little while. But God is at work in more ways than we know. And God's purposes are beyond whatever we might try. And God's going to do more than we can even box him into, like Peter tried. And God's pointing us towards something, towards a kingdom where he's at the heart and where his light is the life of all people and shining through his people. And I think about Revelation chapter 21, the vision of the city of God, where the glory of God is the light and the lamp is the Lamb. And Paul, what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, that all of us with unveiled faces are seeing the glory of God as though reflected in a mirror, and being transformed in that same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. Or 1 John 3:2. John was up on that mountain with Jesus, and he writes later in his first letter, "Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this, that when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is." And Jesus has taken us aside, brothers and sisters, like he did for Peter and James and John, and he's drawn us up that mountain and showing us his kingdom, and he's pointing to the way that where he will come, and he glows, and he glows among us. And this is Christ within us, our hope of glory. Jesus' light has punctured the darkness of the world, and we worship this transfigured Lord, and by his grace, we are on a journey to become a transfigured people, which simply means a people conformed to and transformed by and transparent to the glory of God. And so where are you at? What needs to be transfigured in your life? Where do you need to let God's glory shine through in your life? Where do you need to hear that word again, like God spoke from the cloud and said, "This is my Son, the beloved, in him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Because Jesus knows what he's talking about, and he's doing more than we realize, and he's leading us to a reality that is more than we expect and are used to. And I think the Transfiguration is a message of hope. The Transfiguration is a 70-degree day in the middle of February. And I think we live in a cold, cold, cold world that is so often drained of hope. But in the Transfiguration, we catch that glimpse of God's face. He's coming. He's here. There's more going on. We will become like him. Listen to him. We are transfigured by his grace with him. Have you lost hope in life? Then go up that mountain and listen to Jesus. Be transfigured. Have you lost hope in your job? Then listen to him. Be transfigured. Have you lost hope in finding a job? Be transfigured. Have you lost hope in someone in your family? Be transfigured. Have you lost hope in the church? Have you lost hope in God? Then come to Jesus. Because he takes us by the hand and he walks quietly with us up that hill, and we see the bright face of God in him. And we have hope because there's more going on, and God is with his people, and we see the bright face of God. And that is enough. Amen.